Okay, so now we're going to tackle a really, really big area, an area that Stoll spent a whole ton of time on, the Jacksonian era. Now pay close attention to this one because I think he spent like 3 lectures just on Jackson, okay? Again, skeletal outline. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details, but this should kind of get your head flowing in the right direction. All right, let's get started. Jacksonian era, all right? Where do we start? Well, founding fathers, that sort of era of them being presidents, that's not happening anymore, okay? Thomas Jefferson, he's dead. John Adams, he's dead, okay? Monroe, he's our last founding fathers president. It's time for a new generation to step up to the plate. And what we get is sort of an age of political heroes, all right? We're going to have political superstars come out of this period, all right? Jackson, Calhoun, Clay, Webster. These guys are sort of larger than life figures, and they're going to dominate the landscape. And when I say dominate, I'm not just talking about like in the newspapers. I'm talking about in everyday life. People really admired politicians at this time. People had pictures of politicians in their homes. Everybody talked about politics. This was a real age where basically politics were what people did, you know? It was something that everybody partook in, okay? And that kind of has to do with some of the principles that were going on in this era. 2 big ones, equality and opportunity. Those kind of sum up what the Jacksonian era is all about. First of all, we have universal manhood suffrage. Okay, that falls into the equality branch, all right? We're not just going to have those land-owning men voting anymore. If you're a man, you can vote. It's a step in the right direction for universal suffrage. It's going to make quite a difference in the elections. It's an interesting thing, and it definitely reflects Jackson, who comes from humble beginnings and sort of has a dislike for the elite echelon of America. Another thing, we have a direct election of the Electoral College. We're no longer going to rely on state legislators to appoint these people. We're actually going to have a direct vote in the Electoral College, which means that more power to the people, you know? Also, we're going to implement the spoils system. Very Jacksonian here. Jackson is the guy who brings this about, but basically it's this idea, hey, you know what, if I'm the top dog, if I win the election and I have the power to give jobs to people, I'm not necessarily going to give them to the best person for the job. I'm going to reward the people who supported me. So if I become president, I might give my #1 supporter the position of Postmaster General. It's not a job that requires a great deal of expertise, but it's a nice way to reward a friend. It falls under that opportunity part of this, okay? There are opportunities available here that wouldn't otherwise be available. It gets to this idea of appreciating humble origins. Like I said, Jackson, humble origins, born in a log cabin. People appreciate that. They feel like he's one of them, a real American, not one of these snobby elites, you know? And it gets to, when I said elites, a hate for elites too. Nobody really trusts the rich. They feel like there's severe corruption going on in this country, especially in things like the banks. And Jackson's going to reflect that hate for the elite. And that's going to be pervasive through all of this era. Politicians are really going to push humble origins, you know, and all this stuff, equality and opportunity. So, how does it actually manifest itself? Well, let's start with some of the elections, all right? First of all, got the election of 1824. Just finished with Monroe, finished with the era of good feeling. We're done with the founding fathers. It's time for a new generation. So we got 4 guys up for the election, okay? We got Adams, John Quincy Adams. We got Clay, Crawford, and Jackson. 4 dudes, all of them pretty big political people. Crawford's going to drop out very quickly. So it basically goes down to Adams, Clay, and Jackson. And election happens, popular vote goes to Jackson. He gets about 40%, but the Electoral College vote, which is the important vote, actually leads to a 3-way tie. Adams versus Clay versus Jackson. We're in an interesting little scenario. okay? Basically, here's what happens. When we have a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. House of Representatives split, goes to the Speaker of the House, who happens to be Henry Clay. Henry Clay, always the great compromiser, says, you know what, I'm willing to, I don't really like Adams. I don't really like Jackson, but I do like you, Adams. And I tell you what, if you make me Secretary of State, we'll call it even. I'll vote for you to be president. People don't really suspect this was a corrupt sort of thing. Most historians think Adams said, sure, why not? You can be Secretary of State. And it's definitely documented that he did not like Jackson. Clay really didn't like Jackson. So this was probably going to happen one way or the other. But when Adams, President John Adams, makes Clay the Secretary of State, America looks at this like he's sort of anointing Clay to be the next president after he's done, because how it's basically gone is whoever's Secretary of State becomes the president after the current one is done. So this infuriates Jackson. He calls this the corrupt bargain. He believes that Adams and Clay have made an under-the-table bargain, undermined him, and have basically sealed the future of this country. And Jackson is so furious that he's going to spend the next 4 years planning the demise of John Adams. So Jackson says, all right, I got to get my vengeance. What am I going to do? I'm going to hook up with this guy named Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, New York politician, probably one of the greatest political minds of all time. This guy invents modern political parties as we know them today. Jackson comes up to him and says, you know, I can't believe I lost. I won the popular vote, and yet these assholes are the guys who are in office. And he says, you know what, you're right. You were democratically elected. And he says, we're going to have to start a new party. Now you remember, in the era of good feeling, we only had one party. Here, Jackson says we need a new party. Van Buren says we need a new party because we need to get away from this Republican ideology and push this Democratic ideology where the people have a voice. And that's kind of where we get the name of it. And yes, this is the Democratic Party that we know today. Van Buren takes this idea of the Democratic Party and he organizes it through a modern party system, okay? So what does that mean? He's going to organize it on a local level, on a state level, on a regional level, on a national level. He's going to get all these people together under this banner of the Democratic Party. And people get really excited for this because it gives them direct contact with the politician. They feel like they genuinely have a voice, whether it be on the local level or the national level, and they feel like they have a direct ear to the politician. This is going to be wildly, wildly successful. And Adams, who sort of is just kind of lost in his presidential world and doesn't claim to have a party because he really does believe in that Washington idea of, hey, no political parties in this country, he just kind of ignores it. And by the time 1828, the next election rolls around, Jackson completely wipes the floor with Adams, okay? I mean, we're talking about a slaughter. Adams goes out. Jackson is put into office. And Jackson is a different kind of president. Jackson is going to be super powerful. He's going to basically not let Congress push him around. Before Jackson, basically whatever Congress said went. It was very, very rare for a president to veto anything. Not with Jackson. He's going to veto all kinds of stuff. If he disagrees, he's going to toss it out. That's just how he is. He's going to reward friends, and he's going to really get at enemies. If you get on his bad side, he will come after you. Just sort of that Jacksonian attitude. A couple things you definitely need to know from his presidency. Two things in particular. You got the nullification crisis and the war on the bank. Okay? Let's talk about the nullification crisis. This is probably the most important one, so pay close attention. So, you remember Hamilton. Hamilton says, hey, we got to support manufacturing in this country. How are we going to do that? Well, tariffs is one way. We're going to tax all kinds of imports coming to this country. That way people will be encouraged to purchase local goods, especially manufactured goods. So this actually works all right, especially in the North where there's a lot of manufacturing. The South, however, they don't like this. there's not as much manufacturing in the South, and they suffer from these tariffs. So they call them the tariff of abominations. So eventually these tariffs come up again. They pass Congress, and they get in front of Jackson. Everybody in the South says, great, we got a Southerner as the president. There's no way he's going to keep these tariffs around. Jackson doesn't veto them. Jackson does nothing. He lets it slide. The tariffs are put back into effect. This infuriates the South, especially South Carolina, especially John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, he's sort of the legendary Southern political figure at this time. He's going to say, hey, you know what? I think a state, he's a great legal scholar, I think a state can declare something unconstitutional, especially if it blatantly favors other states. He calls this nullification. South Carolina takes this idea and they decide to nullify the tariffs. They just stop implementing them. Okay? This utterly infuriates Jackson. Jackson loses it. And he says, you know what? I'm going to invade South Carolina with military force. I'm going to make those fools pay. So, right before he does that, Henry Clay, again, comes to the rescue. Mr. Compromise swings in, and he gets together what he calls the Tariff and Force Bill. Okay? Does three things, really important things. They say, all right, South Carolina, I tell you what, we'll get rid of the tariffs slowly over 10 years. Sound fair? They say, okay. They go to Jackson, they say, listen, Jackson, you have the right to go in there with the military. If a state blatantly disobeys something, you can do that. All right? So it kind of preserves Jackson's ego a little bit. It preserves the power of the office. It says, you have the right to use military on the states. Okay? Finally, and this is probably the most important one, states can nullify laws. If it's blatantly unfair, what John C. Calhoun suggested, that's technically constitutional. Okay? Now these are huge decisions, and they're going to affect the historical narrative. Basically, kind of like Stoll said, this is a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. Why? Well, three things. First of all, it provides a mechanism for a state to secede. Okay? You can nullify it. You can say, hey, we don't like the way you're treating us on a federal level. We can nullify that relationship and secede. Okay? That's huge. That's going to play directly into the Civil War. Second of all, a southern state got its way. South Carolina got rid of the tariffs. Yeah, over a 10-year period, but they won. The fact is, the North liked them. Congress passed those tariffs. They said, hey, we like these things. But one state raised its voice, and one state who raised its voice got its way. Finally, super important right here, the president can use military force. This is, again, super important for the Civil War. When South Carolina does secede, Lincoln is going to have precedent for using military action at Fort Sumter. This is important stuff, guys, and it's going to be really, really important as we go along in our history class. Finally, let's go over the bank war, okay? National Bank, all right, you guys remember Hamilton again. Hamilton, he puts together this national bank, really important because it kind of regulates currency, it keeps other banks in check, it watches out for corruption. It's kind of like the early version of the Federal Reserve, okay? National Bank got a charter in 1816. 1832, in an effort to embarrass Jackson, his political opponents put the bank charter before Congress early. Had a 20-year charter, they put it there 4 years earlier. And they do this because if Jackson says, you know what, he's a big opponent of the banks. He says, you know what, we need to keep the banks around. He looks like a liar, okay? And if he decides to veto it, he's basically sentencing the country to an economic depression. Either way, Jackson's gonna be embarrassed. There's no way he can get out of this situation. What happens is, passes Congress, renewal for the charter, gets in front of Jackson, he vetoes it. And with the veto, he attaches this note that basically declares that the banks, especially the National Bank, is a heated bed of corruption. It favors the elite. It does nothing to benefit the common man. In fact, it's anti-democratic in every way. And surprisingly, the country loves this. They say, hell yeah, Jackson is a common man. He's watching out for us. He doesn't want the elites walking all over us. The national bank is just a big, bloated, corrupted figurehead. And we're so glad to get rid of it. So it totally backfires on his political opponents. Jackson looks great after all this, but he was wrong about the bank. That's the thing. This is going to lead to a major economic depression. What happens? So we got all this federal money. We got to put it somewhere, so we decided to put it in state banks. We call these pet banks because they're banks that Jackson favored. So these pet banks, they get all this federal money. But in 1836, we decided to do specie circulation, which basically means gold and silver only when we're talking about government business. So people get wind of this and they say, you know what, I guess we're going to have to make sure that we actually have honest to goodness gold and silver. So they go up to the banks and they say, hey, we want our gold and silver out. And the banks, who were a little bit corrupt, they say, shit, we actually don't have as much money as we say we do. We've spent more money than we actually have, and now that everybody's coming and asking for their money at once, we can't pay them back. So we have this massive issue of banks having money that doesn't really exist. And this is going to cause our economy to go to a complete halt in 1836. This is going to happen after Jackson's presidency. Van Buren will be in charge. But it's a major, major issue, and it is directly linked to that veto. Okay? So that is a brief overview of Jackson. I just wanted to go over some of the big stuff like the nullification crisis, the election, sort of what the Jacksonian Era is all about. I skipped out on some stuff. The Trail of Tears, you definitely should know about that. Daniel Webster deserves a little bit more attention. All of that's in your notes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. But yeah, that's just a basic outline. Let me know what you think. Good luck on the test. Don't be afraid to talk to me, the other TAs, Dr. Stoll, make an appointment, anything. All right? All right, hope that helped out.